Welcome to Sizzle Fantasy Sports, the channel with the most sizzling hot fantasy takes and analysis, presented by your host, Gavin.
Rodgers clean pocket, throws the middle of the end zone. Devontae, touchdown, and a dagger!
How's it going, and welcome to today's video. My name is Gavin, and today I'm going to be continuing what has virtually become running back week here on the SFS channel, as 3 of the 4 videos I've posted to this point have been focusing in on that position group and making sure we know what we need to do to get this spot right in our lineups this season. The trend for the last couple of years now has been you have to be competent at the running back spot and have guys who are good enough to take you to the finish line if you want to ultimately win those fantasy leagues. That's the goal here. We want to be winners. We want to be taking home that trophy at the end of the season, winning some prize money. So we need to know what we're doing here at this running back spot because it's one of the most important positions in our lineups, and it's also one of the easiest to mess up. So for those of you who are a little bit more risk-averse players, today we're going to be talking about some of the lowest risk players in rounds 1 through 3 of the current ADP that I have available to me, and you guys have this as well with the Sleeper Fantasy app. It's what I use for all my mock drafts here. And speaking of which, if you want to join a subscriber mock draft, we did one about 3 weeks back, I'd love to get another one going with you guys. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, but go down and click that bell as well, because you'll be notified as soon as I go live, and it's first come, first serve. So if you're the first one to click on that link, you have the first opportunity to jump in, mock draft with me on the channel. Everyone will see what you're doing. We'll have a good time. We'll talk. I'll grade your team and break down all the picks you make. So it's a really fun time. We didn't have a full spot last time, or not every position was filled in the mock draft. We had 12 spots available. So if you want to jump in there and do that, it's a great experience, something that's really fun. I love doing that with you guys. But nonetheless, here we're going to be talking about today's running backs. We've got about 8 names we're going to go over here. So some guys I really like at the top of boards. I don't think you can go wrong with these players. And if you're looking for some strong pieces, kick back, relax, and let's get started, because today we've got some good stuff to talk about. One more thing to talk about here before we get into the players. If you want to rep some SFS merch, head down to the description of this video. You can be repping the brand with myself and Eric here. We've got our official merch line out. We've got a lot of selections to choose from, and you can get yourself hooked up with some pretty cool and official SFS gear that we've got on our website, sizzlefantasy.com, which is also the home of our draft guide collection for the 2021 fantasy football season. We've got redraft and dynasty leagues. We're pumping out players and we're getting profiles done. We'll be breaking down every single player and their situation in both redraft and dynasty. So we've got a lot of other stuff. Exclusive videos will be coming out soon, and we've got some articles that you're already able to take advantage of and access right now. So we'll be adding plenty more stuff all the way throughout the end of draft season, but you can get that pre-order access right now and check out what we've got available at the moment. So with that being said, my first low-risk player in rounds 1 through 3 is none other than Dalvin Cook, and I figured I would still include some names at the top of the board here. And if you've been watching the channel, I've been talking about this a lot lately. Dalvin Cook is my RB1 for the 2021 season, and this is part of the reason why. Christian McCaffrey is a player I absolutely love, and if I have the number two spot in the draft order, I'm probably taking CMC if he's still available. But for me, if I've got that 1.1 draft spot, I want Dalvin Cook. This is the player I'm investing that top-end draft capital into. He kind of had the label of an injury-prone player, a high-risk player at one point, but over the last 2 seasons, he's played 14 games. And I think that for a player who has that injury label and that's been associated with part of his game, that's something that I think we can start to stray away from now, unless that flares up again in the future. But 14 games out of a 16-game schedule, and we're only playing fantasy for 15 of those weeks, that's pretty impressive. And for the running back position especially, that's something that I think is a fair amount of games to be expected to play. So maybe 13 games is where we start to kind of walk the line of we're missing too much production and time out of them on a consistent basis, if that's how much they're playing on a regular year. But below 13 is probably the cutoff. Nonetheless, though, Dalvin Cook, the thing I love about this guy is, I talked about this a couple days ago with Saquon Barkley, is there's not many one-touch scoring threats in the NFL, and Dalvin Cook is absolutely one of those players. When he hits the edge, he is a threat to take it the distance every single time. I've talked about how I like him a bit more than a CMC because, you know, while Dalvin has had that injury tag thrown around from him, it hasn't been something that's been prevalent in the last couple seasons, whereas CMC saw his worst injury season and the worst year in terms of his health for his entire career last year, and that was a guy who was really, really productive in 2019 and really, really productive when he was on the field last season, but the thing was he wasn't on the field that much last season. So we want to try and keep our information and what we talk about here and relate it back to last year as much as possible and use the most recent data and information we have access to. Dalvin obviously tore his ACL as a rookie, but that was in 2017. So he's grown a lot from them. Then he's had a lot of time to recover, improve his game, and he has certainly done so because he's been one of the most productive backs in fantasy. Another thing I love is the scheduling. He doesn't have too many tough games on the schedule here. I've actually written down a lot of these guys that I'm going to talk about today. They've only got tops 2 or 3 really tough opponents this year on paper. I know teams will make improvements and whatnot, and there'll be injuries, and so stuff will change from now until we get into the heart of the season. But on paper right now, I don't think Dalvin Cook's schedule is too tough. I love his division games, and then I would say that he really only has 2 or 3 total games that I would raise a red flag about, but that's going to come with any player here. Nonetheless, in 2020, some things that were really encouraging for me to see from Dalvin Cook that makes me feel he is the top guy to take here at this spot on the board. 25.8 touches per game. That ranks first among fantasy football running backs last year. This guy's a volume machine. No one touched the football more than Dalvin Cook did last season. Not even Derrick Henry. So when you combine those rushing attempts and those receptions, he's getting the most total attempts out of any player in the National Football League at the running back position, and no receiver is going to have more than that on a per game basis. That would be ridiculous. So Dalvin Cook is one of the most dependable guys. Volume is something you absolutely love to see when you're looking for a low-risk player. They're not always going to have a high ceiling like Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook is an anomaly. He's a player who has high volume, and he has really, really good efficiency with that high volume of touches. He's going to be a player that, he's going to touch it. We saw him take the ball 30-plus times, multiple times last season. So he's going to have games where he's really high up there, and you see little spikes in if you're going to chart out these touching performances. But Dalvin Cook has the ability to, when he gets the ball that often, to then do something with it after the touch. So a lot of these players, maybe we see them get 20 carries, but they're only averaging 4 yards per touch. And then Dalvin Cook comes out here and he goes from 4.5 to 5 yards. So it's a little bit of a jump in efficiency, what you expect from him on a per touch basis. And that's ultimately what I love to see out of him. The scrimmage yards were fantastic last season. He was nearly at 2,000 yards when you add together his rushing and receiving game. And that's something that maybe you talk about a guy who probably had a career year last season. Maybe that peels back a little bit. Maybe we don't see it as high of an upside. 17 touchdowns. Still, if we can get between that 10 and 12 range, if he regresses even 5 to 7 touchdowns, I still really like what I see from him, because I'll talk about a player who finished as the RB6 last season who had double-digit touchdowns, and the touchdown count was cut in half, but still finished as a top 6 back. So there's a lot of avenues for success here. If you're going to take a player at the top of the board, Dalvin Cook is the guy. He's my 1.0 pick. He's involved in the running and receiving game. They've got 2 great receivers there as well. Keeps the box light, and it doesn't take away too many opportunities from him, because this is still a run for his football team at the end of the day. So I love Dalvin Cook for 2021. This is a top-end player, the best of the best. You're not getting much better than him. And then if you want to add one more thing on top of that, he only had 6 plays of 20 or more yards last season. That's something that even if we see the touchdowns and total yardage number drop down, I think maybe he sees more explosive plays next year, because they've had additions to that offensive line. Christian Darrisaw in the first round of that draft is going to make that off-tackle run a lot more explosive and effective. So Cook, 100% I'm in on him this season. I think he's got less risk than McCaffrey, and McCaffrey doesn't have a ton of risk, but just for the sake of me putting Dalvin Cook on this list, I'm going to leave him off because we saw the injuries happen last season, and he's got some pretty darn tough division opponents as well. So moving into the next player here, I've got Derrick Henry, finished as RB2 last season, and obviously Derrick Henry is one of the safest players in fantasy, right behind Dalvin Cook there with 24.8 touches, so just 1 touch per game less than him. And in the last 5 seasons, which he's been in the league, he hasn't played less than 15 games. He played 16 games 3 full times in that span of time when he was a player, and he was not a full 3-down back for the entirety of his career. But it's still relevant that he's only missed 1 game tops in any year of his career, and he played 15 games 2 times throughout. So a player that's really readily consistently available, I should say, and a guy that you can count on to be in your lineups week in and week out. That's something super, super important, and we haven't seen the injury bug affect him yet. He's a really huge bruising back, so he's probably the one imposing his will on others and forcing those injuries. But nonetheless, Derrick Henry here, I love the schedule again, just like Dalvin Cook. I wrote down some notable opponents, the Rams, Tampa Bay, and maybe Chicago is a borderline toughest third outing there. So that's an above-average run stop and above-average defensive unit, but he can certainly have his way with that group. And we saw, Dalvin Cook against the Bears last season. He had decent enough numbers because he had the attempts and he got there. If he finds the end zone, he's going to be just fine. So these are games too where Derrick Henry is one of the more explosive backs after he's given the football. The thing that I love the most about Derrick Henry as a player who only had 19 receptions. I've talked about this with Nick Chubb repeatedly in the past. You want to see running backs have that receiving volume, and that worked into their game. But if they're not going to, you want to see them being highly efficient with the rushing attempts they're given. And Derrick Henry, by far and away, was the best player when it came to making explosive plays last season. He had 16, and the next closest guy was Nick Chubb, and that was 12. And we'll get to him later on in this video as a player I really love for this season. So D-Rock's a guy, he's got his entire offense predicated around him. The Titans want to run the ball. They want to play smash mouth football. Their defense is a little bit lacking. That might be a reason for concern at some points, is if the Titans are getting blown out, he's going to be essentially rendered useless because he's not a receiving down back, as I just stated. But they're going to start this game out every single time. They're going to try and pound the ball. They're going to try and play with the lead. Derrick Henry is he's the core of this football team. They're going to make him the identity of their offense. It's just going to happen. So he'll get his work, he'll get his touches, he'll get his numbers. Derrick Henry, if you're looking for a guy who's going to see high volume and can do a lot of things when he gets the ball in his hands, this is a player you want on your team. And especially being a guy this size, he's going to find the end zone a lot as well, even if he sees some regression from last season. So as mentioned, Nick Chubb up next here, finished as RB10 last season. And the thing that's impressive to me about that is he missed 4 games. Only played in 12 contests last season because he had what looked like a pretty scary injury at the time, but he was able to come back very, very strong. He's going as the RB6 right now. And if you told me I could get Nick Chubb as the RB6 in the season's fantasy, I would be absolutely ecstatic. And that's the situation we see right now. We've got Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Saquon Barkley, and I'm leaving one name out here that I'm forgetting about. CMC, I don't remember who I said, but nonetheless, Chubb is the RB6 right now, and that's something that's really, really crazy. 12 explosive plays, which ranks second behind Derrick Henry at 16, and he only played 75% of the games that Derrick Henry played. That virtually pans out to, if he had played those final 4 games, he probably would have tied him or maybe even surpassed Henry on a per-game basis. So really, really impressive stuff from Nick Chubb. Again, a player who doesn't really see that much work in the receiving game, but he makes up for it because of what he's able to do in the open field. And when he finds space, I mean, he can blow past safeties. He can get past corners in the open field, run guys over. He's going to score touchdowns on the goal line. He's roughly a 20 per touch game guy. He's about 19.7. And that's just fine. If you're looking at the RB6, I mean, there's very few guys who actually get over that 20 touch per game marker. So the fact that he's doing that with virtually no receiving game worked in at all is very, very good news for fantasy owners. He's got a top 5 O-line in the league, maybe arguably has the top offensive line. That's something we love to see out of running backs. That's what helps him be so efficient. And the fact that play action game is very, very effective as well. They're able to keep the box light at times if Baker's able to throw the ball consistently. So, and then the team. The Browns are a loaded football team. This is going to be a team that wins a lot of games next year. They're going to have the lead in games. They're going to be running out the clock, trying to secure those wins, hold the lead late in the fourth quarter. Nick Chubb's going to see his work. You don't have to worry about it anymore. The Browns are a legitimate NFL team, and that helps in fantasy in certain situations. So that's something I factor into all my players' fantasy values is how does the situation of their team affect the fantasy player and the potential production they'll have? If the player's playing for a complete garbage football team and they're a running back, if they're not a good receiving back, you should lessen the value you put on that player because they're not going to be on the field, not seeing touches, because if their team's getting whooped, they're going to be behind, throwing passes, trying to catch up late in games. So that's not the case with the Browns here. They're going to be leading and trailing, they're going to be leading heading into the fourth quarter, late in the fourth quarter. They're going to try and win football games with Nick Chubb. He is, again, the core of this offense. Doesn't see quite as much work as a Derrick Henry, but still a guy that has a very, very prominent role and is probably the heart and soul of this offense as a whole. So JT, Jonathan Taylor's up next here. Finished as RB5, so above a Nick Chubb, but still going after him in fantasy drafts as the RB7 right now. Again, based off of Sleeper Fantasy's ADP. 3 tough games again for JT, just like some of these other players. The Rams, San Francisco, and Tampa Bay. Those are all pretty formidable front sevens, but at the end of the day, when you're looking at a team that is, again, these are all run-first teams so far. These are all teams that make it a point of emphasis to pound the football down the other team's throat and try and out-tough the other side of the football and win that way. They set up the rest of their offense through the run game. JT got going slow last year. Finished as the RB5 still though. He had 13 official starts. I would argue though that he was really only the workhorse back in this offense for about half of those, and that's when he was able to pop at the end of the season. He was struggling early on. They had a really prominent rotation going with Wilkins and Naheem Hines seeing legitimate touches because Jonathan Taylor was just not adjusting to the game well yet. And then he burst out, and he was insane the last 4, 5, 6 weeks of the season. He was a league winner, and he went absolutely bananas. He's going to do that again this year. He's got a super easy division schedule. You get the Jags, the Texans, and the Titans twice a year each. So that's 6 super easy cakewalk games in terms of opposing run defenses. Again, I said only 3 tough matchups that I saw on paper from the immediate eye test. That's what you like to see out of these running backs. There's going to be guys with tougher schedules, and it's not something necessarily to value a Jonathan Taylor over a Nick Chubb, for example, if he were to have a lighter schedule, but it's something you factor into the play because you're going to have to likely start a guy you're taking in the first round here against those tougher matchups. But these are players, they get such high volume, they're big enough, they're physical enough that they're going to see the work on the goal line. That doesn't really concern me because if you pop in the end zone a couple times, you'll be just fine, and that's what we ultimately hope to end up seeing here when these top-end running backs see those tougher games. But JT here, again, the offensive line and the team are a check mark. The Colts are a very, very sound football team. They're going to be playing from leads very often. They're probably the favorite to win the division again this year. And in those division games, like I talked about, they're going to have the opportunity to run the ball out for maybe even the whole second half against teams like the Jags if they really struggle on the defensive side of the ball, or the Texans if they don't have Deshaun Watson, who they only won 4 games with him last year. Imagine how bad they'll be without him. So Jonathan Taylor, a really underrated receiver too. This is a player who with Phillip Rivers really was able to utilize the running back screen game, get out in space, and be a productive pass catcher. I hope that translates with Carson Wentz in the field. He wasn't so hot at throwing checkdowns to Miles Sanders last year, but if he's able to get that part on track and Frank Reich's able to settle him down and reel him in a bit, I think this is going to be a pretty nice fancy situation and a player that we can take advantage of in leagues this year, as, again, being only the RB7 on draft boards. You can get him in the mid-late first round. That's pretty good spot. It's a pretty good spot to take a player who could ultimately be, once again, a top 5 running back and give you some elite potential in production at this position, which, like I said, is so hard to find, and you have to get it right if you're going to win your leagues this season. Next up, I've got a name who is a very late first-round pick. So we're looking at RB8, RB9 territory, depending on how people have Austin Ekeler's, Joe Mixon's, Cam Akers ranked. Cam Akers is a guy I chose to keep off this list for the simple fact that there's just a little bit of question marks and uncertainty surrounding him. I think that eventually he'll get the workhorse role in that offense. I think he could be the RB1 this season if everything goes perfectly right for him this year. But I don't feel as comfortable and as safe about him as I do in Aaron Jones. And here's why. Aaron Jones is a player who finished as the RB2 in 2019 and the RB6 in 2020. His touchdowns from 2019 went down in 2020 from 22 to 11. So total touchdowns, rushing and receiving combined. That's he cut his touchdown count in half by 50% there, and he was still able to finish as a top 7 running back, RB6. So this is a player who gets it done not only as a rushing threat, but as a receiver as well. He has great explosiveness in the open field. He can break away. We've seen him score from 75 yards a couple times, and he's super, super dynamic. Now, I know there's question marks with Aaron Rodgers. Will he be back with the Packers next year? Who knows? Whatever. Aaron Jones is a running back. I know that the offensive efficiency and production as a whole will come down if Rodgers isn't out there, but Aaron Jones is still able to get his one given the opportunity. So he saw a decrease in touches, total touches by over 40 touches in 2020 based off of those 2019 stats. So he actually saw a decrease in the amount of opportunity he was given last season, and that's because of how prominent of a role Jamal Williams played in this offense. He was on the field a lot more than people realize, and I talked about this a couple videos ago. They would take Aaron Jones out for a complete series or 2 at a time just to give Jamal Williams reps. He was getting goal line carries. He was snatching away touchdowns. Jamal actually had a lot of receiving touchdowns with Aaron Rodgers. And I think that it's undervalued how much he took away from Aaron Jones from an opportunity perspective. He's out of the picture now. We don't have to worry about Jamal Williams taking receiving volume and taking that opportunity away from him. Aaron Jones was such a good receiving back in 2019 when he was the RB2. He was neck and neck with Christian McCaffrey too, and I don't think people realize how close it was between the two of them. all it's going to take is some more production in the receiving game, and maybe once again we see him bounce maybe back up to the mean of those 2 touchdown counts. Maybe it's 13, 14, 15 territory. I think Aaron Jones has it in him, and with A.J. Dillon coming on the field, he'll be an effective rusher, and I expect him to see just as many opportunities in the carries department as Jamal Williams, but A.J. Dillon's not a productive pass-catching weapon. That's not what he does well. That's not his strength. I think he's a bit clunky as a receiver, and it looked a bit awkward at times when he was throwing the football last year, so I expect Aaron Jones to see an uptick in his volume back to those 2019 attempts numbers at least. Maybe he doesn't get to that touchdown count because that's a pretty crazy number to get to, but I do think at some point we will see the amount of touches and opportunities he gets level off close to that 280, 290 marker, which I think is a really good spot to be at if you're a running back picked at the late end of the first round. Now we're breaking into some running backs that we're going to start seeing here probably at the top to mid of the second round. Maybe in some situations in a standard league, an extreme case, these players go at the end of the first. But Joe Mixon finished as RB49 last season. He got injured, only played 60 games. So why do I like Joe Mixon as a low-risk investment here? Well, again, he was a first-round pick last year. He was going with the 7th or 8th pick in all leagues. You can get him in the middle of the second this year in certain situations. So there's been a drop-off in ADP that's been adjusted for. We all know the injury risk is somewhat there, and it's in the back of people's minds, which is why I think he's not going as early as he should be. But I'm absolutely comfortable with where he's at. I'd be happy if he didn't move up at all in ADP throughout the rest of the summer. It's bound to change by at least a few spots one way or another, but Joe Mixon's a player who had elite volume when he was on the field. In those 6 games, he averaged 23.3 touches per game. And if you've been sticking with me throughout today's video, I forgot to go over Aaron Jones. He only had 17.7 last year, and that was quite a big drop-off from Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry at 25 and 24.8. So Joe Mixon has the highest volume on a per-game basis of any of these players since that top 2 that I went over, who are top 4 first-round picks regardless of what league you're playing or what scoring format. So maybe there's a case to be made in a full PPR league where Derrick Henry's like the 5th or 6th pick because he doesn't catch passes. But nonetheless, Joe Mixon's volume up there, he's in a territory with players who he hasn't been able to produce to the level of because he hasn't been able to do it on a consistent basis throughout an entire season. But the first few years he was in the league, he's played 14 or more games every single season. So that's something I think bodes well for him. He has missed a couple games here and there in those years, but 6 games was the fewest games he had played in his entire career. I think he'll get back up there. I think he'll be more healthy this season. Injuries isn't something I like to bet on, and I do like to bet against them happening. And while I did talk about a CMC having some more risk than a Dalvin Cook because of the injuries we saw from him last year, this is a player, remember, we're talking about it's a top 2 pick, maybe even the first overall pick in your leagues. McCaffrey was still the first overall pick last season, and rightfully so. He absolutely 100% deserved it last year when he had no prior injury history. Now that we only saw him for 4 games last year, it becomes a bit more scary and a bit more of a risk when you're taking him at that top spot in your leagues, because if we have deja vu and things play all over again, you can't have the first player you're investing into here be that type of a player. But here, like I said, it's already been adjusted for in his ADP falling 6, 7, 8 spots down the board here. Middle of the second round, it's fine to take somewhat of a risk because I still think it makes him a low-risk player at this spot. So Mixon, the volume is great. He gets work as a runner and a receiver. Zach Taylor has come out and said that this is a 3-down back. They want to use Joe Mixon in the running and receiving game. He was actually at training camp out running routes and catching passes as a split-out wide option. I don't think they're going to have Joe Mixon playing wide receiver when they just went out and drafted Jamar Chase. But it shows you they're comfortable with getting him involved in that phase of the game, which, again, is something we absolutely love to see. So if Mixon can get back to that 13, 14 game territory that I talked about at the start of this video, 13, you're kind of walking the line there where I'd like to see you play 13 or more games. 14, you're sitting good. I think that's a good spot to be at and a good spot to expect your running backs to play because you'll have versatile options on your bench that can be a plug and chug for a week or two if need be. So Mixon, the risk is worth the reward here. And like I said, I think it's a very calculated risk, and that's what fantasy football is all about. And that's why I've got him on the list here today, because I think at the spot he's currently at on the board, it's a low-risk situation for me. Maybe if he rises up 5 spots in the next month or so and he's looking at that 12th overall pick, I'll start to question it a bit more and debate whether or not I think he's worth it at that spot, because there are other backs I would certainly take before him as mentioned on this list. So Mixon, though, where he's at right now, we're good to go. You got the green light from me here. And then Austin Ekeler, another guy who had some injuries last season. He's fallen down boards a little bit. He was a late first-round pick a season ago as well, and he only played in 10 games last year. But let me tell you, this guy is a mini McCaffrey when it comes to PPR leagues. Austin Ekeler is one of the highest volume receiving backs there is, and he also sees a substantial amount of rushing attempts where you can depend on him to get his numbers. He saw a crazy amount of targets. He only played 10 games, like I said, 65 targets in those 10 games. That was top 7 among top 30 running back finishers. And like I said, he only played 10 games. So think about how many potential targets he would have if he played 16 games, or this year 17. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he only plays 15, but still, you can do the math there. Figure out 6.5 catches per game times 15. You're looking at a lot of targets there. The only guys that were ahead of him was like J.D. McKissick, David Montgomery, Alvin Kamara, Mike Davis, and a couple other names. Nyheim Hines. The 3 or 4 of those guys are scat backs only. Alvin Kamara obviously being one of the premier backs in fantasy football, but still being the one, obviously his skill being that pass catching trait. And then David Montgomery is kind of an oddball out there, but still really good to see him involved in those numbers as much as well. He's a player I really considered for this list, but based off of some borderline 3rd and 4th round ADP, he might be seen in a video a little bit later on here. Maybe his ADP vaults up a little bit too, and we see him start going earlier and earlier. But nonetheless, Austin Ekeler, a player I love in PPR leagues, and something that was limiting him a bit last season. So he had the receiving volume, that was great. But the actual rushing attempts weren't all that good because the Chargers' offensive line was a disaster. They addressed it this offseason. They drafted Rashawn Slater in the first round and added all-pro center Corey Linsley, from Green Bay. They made improvements where they needed to. This offense is going to need some time to get some chemistry together to start working in unison. But Ekeler's a small back. He's going to get lost in holes. He's going to spring free and have some really nice carries. I think it's a situation that you're looking pretty good in here. You've got Justin Herbert. That offense is going to be rolling. And with all those checkdowns, he's going to have the opportunity to make some big plays. So if we can see his touchdown numbers come up a bit this season, maybe we can even see some flashes of that 2019 Austin Ekeler. That's where I get that mini Christian McCaffrey reference from. If anyone recalls how good he was when Gordon was off the field during his holdout, his numbers were insane. It was hard to find a running back better in fantasy football than Austin Ekeler over that stretch of games. We could potentially see that again with some high upside quarterback play, and if he's able to create in space again like he was that season, because what he did after the catch was honestly pretty remarkable, and what he did after contact as well, being such a small player, was really, really impressive. So a fun fact, Austin Ekeler is actually the strongest pound-for-pound player in the NFL, whatever that means to you. But nonetheless, Austin Ekeler, very safe investment in the middle of the second round. He's going after guys in some situations like a Joe Mixon. You can grab him around. He's going after a Cam Akers. You can grab him right around the area of a J.K. Dobbins as well. So there's a lot of other names going around him similarly in draft position. So make sure to kind of figure out your league, know where you can get an Austin Ekeler, and know where to expect him, if he'll be available on the board or if he'll be long gone, because that's something that's important too in leagues as well to keep in mind. And then finally, the last player I want to talk about in today's video is Antonio Gibson of the Washington football team. Antonio Gibson's a player I think has really, really, really high potential this year. And as a guy who's going in the 3rd round this season at the moment, I'd love to see him creep into the 2nd. There's some guys I'd consider taking him over, and absolutely guys that are going before him in the 3rd round that should not be, like a Josh Jacobs or a Miles Sanders, for instance. So we need to start valuing Antonio Gibson more, especially not only because of what he did as a rookie and the body of work he had, but because of what his organization is saying, what his coaches are saying right now. He finished as the RB13 last season, super dynamic, was great as a receiving back, and this offense has only gotten better this offseason. Ryan Fitzpatrick in the quarterback room, say what you want about that. It wasn't a great spot either last season, but they added Dyami Brown in the draft, and they went out there and signed Curtis Samuel. That passing game is going to be opened up. Their passing attack was putrid last season. It should get better from here. Logan Thomas is coming back, and they have got J.D. McKissick still as well. So he was a 1,000-yard scrimmage player last year. He had decent production when he was given the chance. Like I said, he wasn't an immediate Week 1 starter in an elite Week 1 lineup play, but he was able to come on strong in the mid-weeks of the season. He did get roughed up. He missed a couple weeks due to injury, but that's something I'm not too worried about here. Ron Rivera has said he sees a big jump for Gibson in this offense this year and has said he wants to see him run more routes and do more in the receiving game, which again is something in a PPR league or any league. We love that because fantasy points come in more efficient bunches when you are given the opportunity as a pass catching threat, because you're able to get out there in space and do things when you're not crowded in a box filled with 9 defenders. So Antonio Gibson, I said it, he should be a second-round pick this season. There are running backs. I would absolutely take him, I would take him before a lot of running backs that are going ahead of him at this moment. So as a dynamic playmaker, as a guy who I think is going to see a lot of volume this season, an uptick in his production as a rusher and a receiver, and be a day one starter in this offense, Gibson is absolutely a low-risk player that you want your hands on for this season's fantasy football. All right, those were some low-risk running backs in rounds 1 through 3 of 2021 fantasy football as the ADP currently stands here in very early June. So be sure, if you have any questions about today's video, to go down in the comment section and let me know. I'll answer any questions. I'll talk about anything from this video and whatnot. Anything fantasy football related, feel free to ask me and I'll let you know. Otherwise, we've still got that Discord event going on. If you want to join the exclusive SFS Discord community, you'll get access to subscriber leagues. You'll get into some community type stuff that you can get involved with, and you'll be able to get free personalized fantasy advice from me. I go on there and check that out a couple times a day. So thank you so much for watching. Make sure to do that, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.